September 1st, 1930. Francis Joseph Sholin was born on the Sholin Farm, 5 miles southeast of Kingfisher, Oklahoma. He was the fourth child born to Charles and Anna. Living in the house was Grandpa Sholin, his parents, his older brothers and sister, Charles, Bernice, and Lawrence. After he was born, his parents had 3 more children, Alfred, Gerald, and Sylvia. The farm belonged to Grandpa Sholin, who lived there until his death. The house never did have running water, and electricity was installed in 1936. His father, Charles, and mother, Anna, were the biggest influence throughout his life. Number 4 of 7, Francis was closest in age to little brother Al. They were 18 months apart. Fran and Al spent a great deal of time playing together. They played ball, boxing, climbing on tractors and pretending to drive. Every once in a while, Fran would walk up to Al and butt him in the forehead. Al would run crying off to his mama. "Mama, Francis is beating me up." Farm life wasn't all fun. Grandpa Charles would put Francis on the tractor, telling him to plow the fields until he came to get him off at the end of the day. Farm equipment also wasn't all work. The boys used their imagination and would climb on the combine and pretend they were flying a big airplane. When Fran was about 7 years old, he began to have more responsibility doing work around the farm. His first job was an egg gatherer. Then, as age progressed, the job of cow getter and calf feeder came into being. Egg gathering was a formidable task for a 7-year-old. There were certain hens, called settin' hens, that were reluctant to get off their nest. When Al got the job to get the eggs, the hens figured, "This guy isn't big enough to push me around." Consequently, as Al approached, the hen would send out a warning, cluck, 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 which meant, "I'm not going to move, and if you get too close, I'll peck you." And sure enough, this would happen, and Al would come running to the house for help. In the fall, when the nights became chilly, the whole family would have to go chase the chickens into the hen house. During the summer, the chickens roosted in the trees or wherever they wanted because the hen house was too hot. When the cold weather came, the chickens would continue to roost outside, so they had to go shoo them into the building. It took the whole family to round up the chickens. Some formed a human corral to get them indoors. Others chased them out of trees. And there were always a few that were stubborn, and you have to throw a dirt clod at them to get them out of the trees. It took several nights of this before the chickens got the message to go into the hen house for their own good. God didn't equip chickens with much for brains. When Francis was 10, he asked his dad if he could have a bicycle. His dad said, "When wheat gets to be $1 a bushel, you can have a bike." It never happened. Francis never got a bike. When he went to school, the other boys had bikes. In September, when it was too hot to play football, the boys would play in the shade with their tractors. The tractor consisted of an empty wooden spool, 2 wooden matchsticks, and a piece of bar soap cut into a washer. The tractor was self-propelled by a twisted rubber band. June 18, 1942, Grandfather Nicholas died. The farm they lived on was part of Grandpa's estate. As a result, the property had to be sold in order to divide the proceeds among the heirs. Rather than purchase the property, Charles decided to move his family to California, where they had bought a small dairy farm 3 miles west of Madera. The dairy farm in Madera came with about 40 head of cows, a bull, and a dog. The dog's name was Rancho. He loved to chase the bull. When Fran's brother Charles came home from the Navy, he salvaged an old '29 Chevy. The boys would ride around the country roads in that old car. Rancho thought that when the old Chevy left the place that he was supposed to go along. The car had to be pushed to get it started. When the engine started, Rancho would be the first one inside and usually in the driver's seat. By the time they dislodged the dog, the engine would be dead and they'd have to start all over again until they got smart and put Rancho in the back seat before they started pushing. Then there was no competition for the driver's seat. After the cows were milked, it was time to play, and one of the games they played was rubber band guns, 2 guys inside the barn and 2 guys out. The guys outside had to kill the guys inside and take the fort. They would play with their cousins. The rubber band gun was made of a clothespin on the back of the handle and inner tube pieces for the rubber bands. When Francis was a sophomore in high school, he invented the two-shot rubber band gun. It wasn't very popular with the other guys. They thought it wasn't fair. The first couple of years Francis was at Madera High, he did not go out for the track team. He had to go home right after school and milk the cows. During PE, the coach put up a bar and asked Francis to jump over it. After he accomplished several jumps, the coach told him he needed to join the track team. When Francis was asked how he could jump so high, he responded, "When we get the cows, we would run and jump over the fences. When you start jumping over barbed wire fences, you don't miss." One day, Francis saw a guy jumping with a big stick, and he could jump a whole lot higher. This is when he became interested in pole vaulting. He practiced at home after the cows were milked. Francis participated in a number of track meets. A journalist from the Madera News took notice of this pole vaulter who could jump 10 feet high. Fran and Al became something of an item in the local paper with their wins at several area track meets. About the time Fran graduated from high school, his dad sold the farm and bought a motel in Red Bluff, California, with his brother Frank. Fran worked at the motel as a carpenter's helper and went to college at Chico State. While at Chico State, he joined the National Guard because he was told you get a whole day's pay for just going to a 2-hour meeting each week. The Korean War broke out when Francis was frozen in the National Guard, unable to join the Air Force or the Navy. He was sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky to train and had to drop out of school. Round about this time, Fran's cousin Virginia started bringing her friend around the motel. Helen Faulkner and Virginia went to high school together. The high school was just up the street from the motel. Fran, Helen, and Virginia played canasta several evenings a week. Their friendship grew. The love affair really blossomed when Fran was sent to Fort Knox. Helen wrote him every day. When Fran returned from Fort Knox, he enrolled in Shasta Junior College. It was cheaper than Chico State, and if he was called to war, he wouldn't lose too much tuition. Fran was on the track team at Shasta, setting a school and league record with a 12-foot vault, which was pretty good in those days before fiberglass poles. He made that vault with a steel pole. Al and Fran also joined the football team. During practice, Fran was kneed in the head. Helen's dad, Dr. Faulkner, diagnosed him with a concussion and told him that this was very serious and that he shouldn't do it again. So Fran quit the football team. By this time, Helen and Fran were an item. After graduating Shasta College with an AA, Francis enrolled in California State University, Berkeley as an engineering major. Helen also went to Berkeley and enrolled in Armstrong Business School. When Helen finished her degree, she went home for the summer to visit her parents. When she came back, she informed Fran that her mother was planning their wedding. She would do everything. Pick the wedding dress, pick Fran's clothes. All he had to do was show up. After Fran and Helen were married, they rented the upper floor of a house in Berkeley. The lower floor was occupied by the owners, a retired judge and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Most. Mrs. Most was very friendly towards them, and she would always stand at the bottom of the stairs and say, "Yoo-hoo," when she wanted to come up and visit. To her, renting the apartment upstairs was a plus for her social life. When Fran and Helen went to look at the apartment initially, Mrs. Most told them that they did not take children, which is probably one of the reasons that they got the apartment, was because at that time they had no children. However, when Barbara came along, they did not get kicked out. Mrs. Most was thrilled to have a baby in the house. Prior to graduation, Fran interviewed with 10 companies and received 10 job offers. He chose North American Aviation because he was familiar with the company. They had built the B-51 Mustang. Fran had followed all of the aircraft throughout the war. North American Aviation built the B-51, which he felt was the best fighter aircraft. On top of that, they offered him the highest salary.
$425 a month. The small family moved to Los Angeles, near the International Airport, where the plant was located. That was in 1956, when the aircraft industry was primarily in Los Angeles. Initially, Fran, Helen, and Barbara lived in a small one-bedroom duplex in Inglewood. They introduced themselves to their neighbor, who was a friendly guy and a family doctor. Dr. Zevin became Helen and Fran's doctor and delivered Bill when he was born. They lived in that duplex for about a year before they bought their home in Hawthorne.
In 1958, Helen and Fran bought the house in Hawthorne. It was 2 miles from where he worked. The house cost $16,000 and was 1,200 square feet. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. Barbara and Bill each had their own bedroom. 4 more children were born in Hawthorne: Anne, Jim, Helen, and Karen. In 1965, Helen was pregnant with her 7th child, and North American Aviation was laying off. Fran didn't know if he would be laid off or not, but in speaking with a friend who had worked for Lockheed, that friend had asked him to apply at Lockheed because they had just received a government contract to build the first supersonic transport. Lockheed offered Fran a pay raise and the title Senior Research Specialist, which was a notch above his current title, Senior Engineer. The Hawthorne house was put on the market and the family moved to Burbank.
Fran was at Lockheed for 6 years, 1 year on the supersonic transport, 1 on a research project, and 4 on the L-1011. The L-1011 was in flight test by then. Fran had no intention of leaving Lockheed, but when layoffs came, another engineer was scheduled to be laid off. He happened to have the same job title as Fran, Senior Research Specialist, and he had more years of service. And while he couldn't do the same job as Fran, he had more years of service. Therefore, due to seniority rules, the engineer was allowed to bump into Fran's department and take Fran's job. Francis contacted an old co-worker from Rockwell, formerly North American Aviation. On Monday, he had a job with Rockwell as senior research scientist. He started working on the B-1. This was in 1971 during the Nixon administration. He commuted from Burbank to Los Angeles, which was a difficult commute because he had to go through downtown Los Angeles with impossible traffic. The search began for a house closer to Rockwell.
Fran and Helen moved to Northridge in 1973 and lived there until 1990. Initially, Northridge was pretty rural, lots of horse farms and open spaces. The family did a lot of hiking in the hills around Northridge, exploring Devil's Punch Bowl, Vasquez Rocks, and the Angeles Forest. In the later years at Northridge, grandchildren began to arrive. April and Alex came to live with Fran and Helen. Many more grandchildren were born while they lived in Northridge. At Rockwell, throughout the 80s, Fran was on the design team for the B-1 bomber. A problem arose with this aircraft when the lower rudder linkage continued to fail in flight test. It had to be fixed. One day, a group of management and engineers came to Fran to fix the problem. Fran explained to the management team that he specialized in internal dynamics and that the plane's problem was external dynamics. Management told Fran that there was no time for a wind tunnel. The fix had to be done without a wind tunnel test, and he had 2 weeks to find a solution and have it on the airplane. Fran got out the Rolls-Royce manual and had to make his own estimates regarding the airflow from the nose. How big would the vortex generator have to be? And where does it need to be positioned exactly? He designed something, explained to them where it should be placed, and lo and behold, it worked. This was a huge achievement, a very important deal for Rockwell, because if they didn't get the airplane fixed, they would not have met the flight test deadline set by the Air Force. In 1986, Fran received the Engineer of the Year award.
The problem solving on the B-1 was a huge deal, and receiving the Engineer of the Year award was one of the highlights of Fran's career. Of all the places that Fran and Helen lived, Post Falls was by far the nicest. The people were great, the scenery was beautiful. During these retirement years, Fran and Helen raised their two eldest grandchildren, April and Alex. Numerous more grandchildren were born, 16 in total. Great-grandchildren are 16 to date. While this was Fran's retirement, he did anything but retire. He was a substitute teacher for the Catholic school, tutored boys and girls at his home along with April and Alex, as well as numerous tasks for the nuns. He hiked and panned for gold with the grandchildren as they came to visit. And when Space Access needed an inlet specialist, they called Fran. Fran has several patents filed for the Space Access ramjet engine. His life was his work, solving problems to make airplanes fly. His faith was a big part of his life, and in later years he was able to give the church not only through donations, but through many works. His family brings him great joy, and he now counts every new great-grandchild and longs to meet each of them in person. His life goes on, and we're curious to see what he does next in Post Falls, Idaho.